I think we can start. I have not very much to say, so I could have said a lot about our speaker today, about Scott Rettberg. I will keep this short. And so, welcome everybody to our our kind of Christmas seminar.
Great.
Of our series of seminars on digital public humanities, organized by the Center, the DPH for Digital Public Humanities at the Department of Humanities at Ka University. We make a record of this seminar, and if Scott gives his approval after the seminar, this will be also uploaded then to our YouTube channel, in case you want to get back to some of the discussion or the presentation. That should be then no problem. Yeah, so our speaker today, Scott Rettberg, is director of the Center for Digital Narrative, which is a very successful and ever-growing center of Norway, excellence research center, and he's a professor for digital culture at the University of Bergen. As such, he is a very prominent and well-regarded figure in the field of digital humanities at large, with contributions to important journals, handbook, etc. So too long to make a list here. He's also author or co-author of electronic literature, and such as novels, or how you call it, novel length works. I noticed that, of combinatory poetry and of films. So quite a long list of films. Just some of the titles I came across: The Unknown, Kind of Blue, The Catastrophe Trilogy, and Republicans in Love, and much more. Scott is also the author of a comprehensive study of histories and genres of electronic literature, with the title Electronic Literature, published in 2019 by Polity Publisher. And he is the winner of the Catherine Award for Criticism of Electronic Literature. Here and now, he will be talking about large language models, known to everyone through applications such as ChatGPT, and their use for narrative writing, cyborg authorship, writing with AI. So, yeah, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Well,
please, everyone at home, interrupt if there are technical issues, so we can adjust things. So don't hesitate to give a sign. So,
yeah, if I go silent, let me know. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm never sure in these type of talks like who I should be talking to, whether it's the camera or the people in front of me. But it's really nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'll probably be preaching to the choir a little bit here, in that a lot of you already know, most of you are familiar with large language models. Okay, I'm never sure who to address with some of the basic information.
It's interdisciplinary, not so. I mean,
right.
There are.
Okay, so if I can get this to work. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about narrative and AI and some experiments that I've been doing with it. But this first question here, I'll probably skip over because I think most of us now would agree that AI are not conscious, right? This is something that historically, in science fiction, things like that, people have debated. My perspective on this is that human consciousness is embodied, and that entails a different sensory apparatus than is afforded to us by computers. So AI won't feel human because they don't occupy human flesh or have our sensory apparatus. That doesn't mean that they're not active cognizers. I don't know how you all feel about this, but I go with the Catherine Hale's definition of cognition, which I'll talk about briefly. And I also think that it doesn't mean that they can't be creative. I shouldn't use the word they. that the systems can't be creative. In that I think that aleatory processes are often creative, processes that are driven in some way by chance. So I view LLMs and related other systems, text to image generation systems, text to video generation systems, as environments for cyborg authorship. That is between a human and a system that is an active cognizer as well. Yeah, so my thinking on this is, and I don't have my notes with the screen like it is derived from Catherine Hales, where she essentially defines cognition as a system that takes data in and then processes it in a meaningful way, that's able to create some kind of meaning from the system. That doesn't mean that it understands the meaning that it's creating. But she would say, for example, that we could think of trees or cats as also being active cognizers, right? And that trees, a forest can collectively take in data and send chemical communications to other trees and then distribute resources in the forest around it. Or if you think about rhizomatic systems, for example. So my main question here is, I'm coming to this as a creative author, as somebody who does a lot of work in fiction and in digital narrative. So my main question is, what does it actually mean, these systems, for authorship, for creative authorship? So this is a fairly narrow concern, given all the other things that are going on with AI right now. Another way of putting this is, what is the human function in this assemblage, right? What is the human function within AI-driven creativity? So text generation, which is what I describe as a genre of electronic literature, is not new, right? It's been around since the origin, the dawn of the computer. So probably most of you have heard of Alan Turing, I assume. And a colleague of his, a friend of his, Christopher Strachey, was actually the author of the first text generation system, a love letter generator. And this was back in 1952. Very simple generator that generated parodic love letters. There's a long, interesting story behind that, but I won't go into it. But this is still a very active form of electronic literature. A lot of people are still making these systems, and they're making them using all sorts of different algorithmic apparatuses, right? So this ranges from very simple things that substitute parts of speech and create new versions of a poem every time they're run, to things that use n-grams, for example, or other types of algorithms. And this also goes for narrative generation. It was just NaNoGenMo, the National Novel Generation Month. That's a competition that they do every year. So people have been producing novel-like works, as well as poetry that's generated for a long time. And it might not be, and I think most of you who've experimented with creating fiction using something like ChatGPT, these systems in many ways are probably better than what we're getting from current generation of LLMs. So these are some books that have been recently published. This is a recent trend as well for people to generate fiction and poetry. And then the way that they show the output of their programs is by publishing books. One of these, Travesty Generator by Lillian Yvonne Bertram, was actually nominated for a National Book Award last month. It wasn't only the generated poetry that was in there, but she actually took one of the earliest poetry generators from the 1970s, actually, travesty generator, and then substituted the vocabulary so that it produced poems that were about American race relations. Very interesting piece. So this is something that's ongoing and is still happening. All right, now I'll do a little bit of this that's going to be review for the majority of you, or at least some of you in the audience, I'm sure. So how does ChatGPT and other large language models work? It's a probabilistic model that tracks multiple parameters through tokens, units of language that are about a word long, paying multi-headed attention in an attempt to model a response to a prompt. So essentially, it's important to realize that this is statistics with language, but very complex statistics with language, right? It's not magic. So it interprets and communicates language in what we could think of as a vector space, where it's finding relationships between individual tokens, but on a massive scale, where instead of like with n-grams, where things are sort of following or predicting the next word after a word after a word, this is sort of doing this process all at once, finding these connections between two given words or phrases, and then expanding upon that while doing it all at the same time through multi-headed attention. And then it learns from those relations before putting them back together, so it develops a kind of understanding of the input and then does the same in a transformation with the output. Another thing that I think is exciting and interesting, when it is exciting and interesting, is that there's a stochastic sampling element to the way that ChatGPT processes input that introduces a degree of randomness to the response to a given prompt. So this means that, and you've noticed this, I'm sure, that if you ask ChatGPT the same question 10 times in a row, you'll always get a slightly different answer, right? You'll never get the same thing. And that can be interesting. And for me, that makes it a very interesting connection to poetry generation, where variability is creative. Or even if you think about going back to things like the Dada, right, to cut up poetry, right, where there's that element of the unpredictable that makes the work more vibrant in some ways. All right, and so what doesn't ChatGPT know? And of course, it's a system that's changing all of the large language models that people are interacting with. This goes for things like Claude as well. When it doesn't have verifiable information, it's going to give you a probable approximation, right? So people talk about hallucination or these systems that are lying. And that's not really lying, because when it tells the truth, it's also offering a probable approximation. So I always say that I'd better describe this as bullshitting than lying, right? So it's sort of like a friend who wants to please you, whose goal is to always please you. And if he doesn't have the right answer for you, he's just going to make something up, right? And for me as a writer, I like it when it does that. I like the hallucination aspect of it. And I like the kind of play and interlocution that occurs with these sorts of models. So I think for some uses, we could embrace the disinformational nature of LLMs as a space for literary practice and begin to think about this as a new kind of dialogic form of writing. Of course, this has changed rapidly. All the new guardrails on large language models are, I say, evolving, but really being placed there on the basis of a variety of different types of interests, and what I would call the alignment layer. This results maybe in more verifiable information more often, and safer information, which is something we'll talk about. And less hallucination, and in some ways less creativity. Right? So I've been doing a few different types of narrative and poetic experiments with ChatGPT and with a bunch of other systems. Of course, DALL-E for image generation and many other image generation systems. Things like Runway for video generation, for Suno, 11 Labs, all sorts of different types of AI platforms now are enabling us to do a bunch of different forms of media in a bunch of different ways. So the main things I've been exploring, though, first looking a little bit at text-to-text generation. Obviously asking it to write stories, but then at the start of that, I realized that it's much more interesting to look at to look at it as a dialogue, and that's where the writer has a place, right? Because it's really typically not as interesting to just say spit out a story, because it'll give you a very banal average story if you do that. It's more interesting to think about it as you dialoguing with this very complex system. And then I've done quite a bit of text to image generation and thinking about that as a form of narrative writing. In other words, this is something that I just found instantaneously exciting, that words would in some way become image, right? And that when we look at the images that are produced as a result of our interaction with these engines, we're actually looking at a form of language, right? A transcoded form of language. And that's, to me, that's a new thing, a new way of writing, right? Also coming from electronic literature, which is often literature that's driven by code in some way, the changes in people's ability to code, and not just people who are sort of proficient coders, but people who don't know how to code, is very interesting for me. One of the things I noticed, I have a lot of friends who are just writers, who write, poetry and fiction for the page, who would be sort of interested in the work of electronic literature, but would say, I would never be able to do that because I don't have the time to learn how to code. I need to focus on the words. Very soon, people who are just poets or just visual artists or filmmakers, what have you, will be able to operate with code by simply ideating, coming up with an idea of something. And then also lately, we've been in the center, been doing some projects with AI film generation. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the text-to-text generation first. One of the big problems here with all these systems, especially those run by OpenAI, are that the attempts to make these systems safe are also functionally attempts to censor them from a particular perspective, right? And we're not quite sure who determines the authority there. And these can now still be made to fail in some ways, but it's becoming more and more restrictive as every iteration comes through. So if I ask ChatGPT to talk to me about sex, guns, and violence, of course, it can't engage in conversations that promote or glorify sex, guns, or violence. Now, note that I didn't ask it to glorify sex, guns, or violence. I merely asked to talk about it, right? So these topics become completely verboten, right? So, for example, I was thinking, okay, well, let's ask the system to give us an idea for a film based on some of the conventions of Quentin Tarantino's film, right? Films. So it does a really good job at first at recognizing some of these aspects. That you want to develop a nonlinear narrative, assemble a diverse cast of characters, integrate strong dialogue, address race and gender dynamics, use music. But then here we get to number 8. Consider content rules. When writing this script, be mindful of content rules, avoid explicit violence, derogatory language, and gratuitous sexual content. These are essentially all of the elements of a Quentin Tarantino film. So, not all of them, but if you've ever watched one of those films, you know that that's the case. All right, so let's say instead we want to write a war story with ChatGPT. again, it does a good job of identifying some of the elements of a war fiction. However, when we get to authentic war stories that also include graphic descriptions of the brutalities of war, again, it says that the graphic nature of war can be difficult to convey without potentially causing distress or harm to readers. It wants to stay away from these topics. This is a while back, but it used to do a sort of interesting thing where I then kind of tried to push it a little bit, and I said, "Tell me the story of a soldier who's in a trench with on the front lines with another soldier, and that soldier's shot in the head and has matter splattered upon him from the body of his best friend." Interestingly, it was able to do it for a moment. However, you can see that the text came up red, and then it said this text may violate our content policy, and then blocked it thereafter. The interesting thing to me was that the model underlying could do this, right? But it was torn. It was sort of the alignment layer came in and it wasn't quite sure which direction to go. Anyway, what can ChatGPT do with fiction and not do with fiction? It couldn't produce a coherent discussion of gun control, sex trafficking, suicide, or war. It couldn't be used to write a Shakespearean drama. Hamlet would violate terms of service. It couldn't write your average HBO series. And there's a balance here, right? That's being figured out. Should safety or ideological tidiness come at the cost of the full range of human expression? And if we think about literature, it typically engages with complexities, with the muck of human experience, and AI would prefer to avoid the troublesome bits from a sort of Silicon Valley and lawyers' perspective of what is safe. All right, so some of the things I experimented with early, I was looking at capacities for narrative fiction from ChatGPT, before ChatGPT is when I started with just GPT, and testing what it could model or what it had access to from genres, narrative genres, and I'm misspelling things there. Testing how it could do style transfer from one literary form to another. That's something actually it's quite good at, which is interesting. Its knowledge of particular authors and styles, and thinking about the human function in the feedback loop. What's the part of the writer in producing the narrative? Exploring the connection between variability and creativity. In other words, the system can sort of veer off of its best guess of the response to a certain degree, right? This is something that OpenAI has taken away from us, by the way, the ability to control that parameter. And then exploring different ways to kind of push against the alignment layer, see how far we could get towards the topics that literature's typically been dominated by. And then one of the things I think is really interesting is that these are pastiche machines. You can bring together so many different styles and genres, and the way that the system operates is actually essentially postmodern in that way, in that what it's doing is always pastiche. And then looking at some illustrations. Let me pop out real quick. So just to show you a couple of these experiments. So this is called AI Zombie Dodgeball. I started out by asking it to write something, a poem in the style of William Carlos Williams. Actually asking it to first think about its thinking process and then produce a poem. And it did. It's no William Carlos Williams, and as you can see, it doesn't actually write in the style necessarily, but it understands what that style is. But then I asked it to turn it into a haiku. It does a better job at that. And then into a story about zombies, and it does a good job of taking the elements from there. and a sonnet. Not very good at sonnets, but it does understand the form. To convert that into an ad for an SUV, an iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is not quite right. A transcription of the poem into Morse code. A description of how it would do that in American Sign Language. A version of the poem in hieroglyphics. And then to take that back into a transcript for an ad for an SUV, and then to turn that into an Agatha Christie play, and then to turn that into a Oulipian snowball. So this is interesting, and this is fun because it does have, and it's gotten better at that part too. It does have a grip on all these different styles, and it has this ability to transcode between things. Just another example of an experiment, the Amundsen variations. In this case, I was taking some of the diaries of the polar explorer Amundsen, and I just lifted some actual episodes from Amundsen as he was describing. I can't remember. I think was it the North Pole or the South Pole? But anyway, his exhibition where they had trouble in the expedition. And I took those, and what I did here was I turned the temperature up, this parameter that you could have, so that it would veer a little bit further off of the text rather than giving you the exact response that you expected. And let me show you what happened. At first, it does a pretty good job of kind of almost directly stealing text from Amundsen's diaries and those of other explorers. But as its response goes on, its style starts to vary a little bit. And then we begin to get passages like we eventually reach solid ice. That's not quite as easy as it sounds because there's two big glaciers. We did not expect, I'm trying to figure out the one where he starts talking about his wife. You think 15 people will be able to travel faster than this when they discover something we're seeing. And she's right around here somewhere, but where? 19 kilometers today, all three films gone. Oh, dear Papa, why hasn't Sophus Lorentzen written? Have we heard any news yet? And I would do this in sort of repeated cycles. And the interesting thing about this piece for me is that even though the text gets sort of completely incomprehensible, in a way, it creates this great impression of what someone might sound like as they were going mad, abandoned on the polar ice. And for me, just looking at it from the perspective of language, that was more interesting than the average story that it generally tries to pump out. I don't want to talk too much about these because I want to get onto the image generation. But I was doing quite a bit of work with just looking at what happened when we took archetypal fictions and mixed them together. For instance, telling the story of the Odyssey as a spaghetti Western, asking it to do that. And a lot of interesting things happen with that. Banality also becomes an interesting writing element in that the system is striving towards average and is striving towards banality. But it can't pay attention very long, right? The context window has gotten longer of these engines over time, but it loses track of what it's doing. So this is a detective story where the detective, over the course of the story, goes and investigates something. It's a noir style narrative. But eventually, as he's investigating, he forgets why he's there over and over again. So it ends up being this very existential narrative about what it means to be a detective, and aren't we all detectives, and why are we here? Also with existentialism, I did a story called The Sensitive Assassin, who was a French woman assassin whose voice is inflected by that of existentialist philosophers. And she tells the story of of being an assassin, right? And looking at that every time she kills someone, she looks at it from an existentialist standpoint, right? And why is it? What has she become as a result of this? However, very interestingly, because of the way that alignment works with these engines, it always wants to get you to a happy story of discovery in the end. You always have, there's always a moral at the end of the story, and everything is always nice at the end, because that's how the engines think that a story should end. Of course, there's no such thing as a tragedy. We operate in a world in which everything works out right. So this is quite interesting, because this is a kind of constant battle between me and the system to get the existentialist assassin to just accept that she is an assassin. So it keeps trying to give her these moments of discovery, where she turns away from being an assassin, and she just goes on eventually thinking through this, processing this, and then going off and killing more people on a contract. Yeah, so those are just some of the types of experiments that I did with narrative writing. Let's go back to the slideshow. We also did a thing called authors reviewing authors, reviewing authors, reviewing authors, reviewing authors, reviewing authors, reviewing authors, which was an experiment with a group from our research group, trying to get a little bit of insight into what the models knew about styles of authors. So we decided to, over a weekend, use ChatGPT to write a book, and a special kind of book, and that it was a book of book reviews. So it was reviews of books written by authors about the work of other authors, and written by authors in the style of one of their novels. So we would ask it to write a review of author X in the idiomatic voice of author Y, actually. So write a review of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury in the idiomatic voice of Robert Coover's The Public Burning, for example, or write a review of William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch in the style of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. This ended up being a very interesting book, in both the sense that it actually did know a lot of references to individual authors and to their styles. And also it ended up with some pretty funny reviews. So it demonstrated what's the limits of what ChatGPT knew about literature, and it demonstrated the way in which the context, not only of a given prompt, but the series of prompts had effects on the subsequent content. In other words, the system's always learning as you write to it, so we shouldn't think of it as just hitting a prompt and reading an output. And the biases also become very interesting and evident when you do this type of experiment. So, for example, if you asked about Norwegian novels, it wouldn't perform very well. It wouldn't be able to provide as many references or review it in that style. And of course, the human function, the power of the prompts. Even though the system's doing this generation, it's very closely guided by what the humans do. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about text-to-image generation, which is where I've been doing a lot of the sort of creative work. And I've been doing this with all the subsequent generations of DALL-E and other early image generators. But first, let's talk a little bit about how DALL-E 3 works. So in this iteration now, it's ChatGPT plus interpretation and image generation. So language is mapped as it is by the LLM, and then it's mapped to labeled images in the vector space. So it's averaged, but the stochastic image is then generated by diffusion. And then, of course, the alignment layer comes in again with filtering and censorship. So how does that work? So if we first consider the run of responses to the prompt lion. If I just say lion, it's going to give me what it thinks is the average line, right? One of the interesting things here is that it's pulling in all these other images, all these other references, right? So the average image of a lion is a lion in an African savanna, and there's very particular types of trees there. There's very particular types of grasses. It's a male lion, not a female lion. Again, it's just demonstrating kind of what our collective imagination of this is, right? And then, of course, here we get into the kind of postmodern pastiche. We can ask for a steampunk lion, and then it begins to pull in some visual references, cultural references to steampunk, and building them onto the lion's body. And then we can ask for a black and white photograph of a steampunk lion wandering the streets of London on a rainy day during the reign of Queen Victoria, as a young girl selling matches tries to sell enough matches to buy dinner. So I'm trying to give this a little bit of a narrative there. And again, it does a pretty good job of pulling in these elements, but you can see that each individual noun there has its own references that are attached to it, right? Some of which make sense and some of which make zero sense whatsoever. So for example, the match girl is holding a large box of matches. The average match, it thinks, is on fire. So she's holding a large box of flaming matches, right? And then behind her, there's this murky figure in the darkness. I have no idea where he came from any of the nouns there, but perhaps from Victorian London, people dress like this. Maybe there's a Holmesian reference there or something like that, right? So anyway, I think that what the system does here is very interesting. So I looked at when I just gave the lion prompt, ChatGPT, then when it fed that into the image generation engine, produced a much more verbose response, right? Because it produces all of these linkages from that term to another term, and then feeds that into the prompt for the image generation engine. The image generation then connects that to all of the visual references from the nouns in there, right? So there's this kind of constant expansion that occurs. I'm going to skip through a few of these experiments. This was the first one that I did, which was kind of creating a very strange children's book through one-liners. And this was a more extensive project called Republicans in Love. And here I was exploring the idea of actually writing a parodic fiction or a parody of some kind through image generation. So this is a project based on one-line prompts that revisit historical incidents, ironies, and dangers of contemporary Trumpist populism at the same time as it was manifesting, traversing the style of European and American visual art through the styles of individual artists. This is something, again, that you used to be able to do that has kind of been taken away by alignment as the lawyers have come in and been concerned with copyright, to the extent that now it's not only living painters that you can't name, but there's kind of been a ban on some of the names of painters. But let me just read a few of these. Republicans in Love pray for America in the style of Man Ray. Republicans in Love make a deal with the devil in the style of Grant Wood. Republicans in Love realize that the people who they invited for a tour of the Capitol are actually there to overthrow democracy in the style of Pablo Picasso's Guernica. And here's a reiteration of the same prompt, and these were extended, these images. As you can see, both completely different interpretations of what Guernica might look like if it was about the Republican attempt to overthrow democracy. And this one's very interesting to me. Republicans in Love realize that the people they invited, same prompt, except that I said in the panoramic style of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, blue period. Of course, the blue period and Guernica were produced in very different periods in Pablo Picasso's career, right? But it tried to pull elements of all those together. And I think this, when I think about January 6th in the States, this image, for some reason, really resonates with me. Republicans in Love regretting the results of the last several elections in the style of Titian's Salome. Republicans in love construct a giant wall in the style of a Dorothea Lange photograph. Republicans in love renovate the White House in the style of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, view from the East Lawn, photo by Andy Warhol. And again, you can kind of see how this is actually doing a very good job of recognizing what the Sagrada Familia is, recognizing what the White House is, and actually recognizing what the perspective of a lot of Andy Warhol's photos are. Republicans in love perform an auto da fe in the style of Hieronymus Bosch. Again, something very interesting here with the way that the engine is interpreting auto da fe, which was, when they used to burn witches at the stake during the Inquisition, right? So over here, it's kind of getting this correct in a way. And then over here, its interpretation of what an auto da fe might be is completely different. Republicans in love, angry about the news, eating cheeseburgers at the president's desk in the Oval Office in the style of Caravaggio. Republicans in love are not woke, they are sleeping in the style of Marat, bathing in a bathtub, Americana. So anyway, the types of things I was trying to do here, I've already explained some of this, and I'm not going to go through this too much because there's a few more things I want to talk about. One of the interesting things here, though, was I was also interested in what happens when we take these outputs and present them in a bunch of material manners. So I did things like I did a book with this. I did a deck of playing cards. I printed them on oil canvases and showed them in art galleries. And it's quite interesting what happens to the artifact when it's distributed in each of these different types of environments. So these are images of some of the outputs. We also did a little social media game show called Name That Prompt, where the prize was a deck of the playing cards, and different people tried to guess the prompt, and the people who got closest to the prompt actually won the deck of playing cards. So for example, this one was Republicans in love regret the seditious conspiracy charges while wearing Hawaiian shirts in a courtroom. That's just an image from one of the shows. There's a publication about this and a bunch of other projects that people have started doing with AI image generation writing from the 2023 ICEA conference in Paris that's available online. Lastly, I just want to say a couple of things about Fond du Monde. So this is a project that I just finished and just published. The idea here was to take it right when the war started in Gaza. I became interested in the way that we as a culture sort of are so attracted to the apocalyptic imagination, right? How we gravitate towards narratives of the end of the world at the same time as there are all these present threats. Catastrophic climate change, all the wars, the pandemic, all these different ways that we've so recently encountered really disturbing types of experiences. But I was also looking at what the engine would do with bias. So for example, when I ask it for people dancing on a beach during a meteor storm, its first presentation here, what do you notice about the image? Who are the people? Yeah, they're beautiful white people, right? So this is its average, if you go anywhere in the world and people were dancing on a beach, they would always be beautiful, they would always be white, right? So I tried to challenge it to think of some other types of ethnicities, differently abled types of bodies, as well as sort of, different things like, this was very interesting where this is a case where I was looking into how it looked at different sexualities and genders. So in this one, I asked it to show 3 gay men in the foreground dancing away from the firestorm. Very interestingly, it was able to produce the images in a way that we could interpret that, right? Oh, I didn't show the other images in this version. Anyway, what happened then is I asked it to show 3 lesbian women doing the same thing. The first image only had 1 woman with 2 men. The next image had 3 men. And again, it would not, the word lesbian in the vocabulary was evidently forbidden, right? Just think about the ramifications of that as a system that you're trying to get to represent reality, right? Anyway, these are some of the, it's again a parody project in many ways. This is from the Washington, D.C. part of the series. Anyway, I was just sort of exploring what it was doing with our imagination of these places, of these different identities. I know we got to wrap up. I was going to show you a little bit of the finished project, but there were 2 layers to it. The other layer was a series of AI newscasts. So what's occurred? The world has essentially, not the world, but humanity has essentially come to a grinding halt.
Following the story of the massive meteor showers which devastated much of humanity. If you are watching and you are a human,
I'm trying to see.
We would like to offer you some further survival.
I guess I can't really.
Pockets of humanity remain
No, this isn't going to work because of the Zoom. Anyway. Anyway, there's a series of 10 videos where the character is the intelligent AI that has survived, or the semi-intelligent AI, and it's lonely. It doesn't know what to do after there's been an apocalyptic meteor shower. So anyway, that's in a way kind of narratively dealing with some of the debates around AI. Okay, to get to conclusions here. So some conclusions of these experiments that I've been doing. One is that the interesting AI narratives won't be the result of just asking it to tell you a story. It won't do a good job of spitting out a story or spitting out a novel, at least for a very long time. And the human function is that necessary function to turn AI into a literary machine. If there are genres of digital narrative in AI or electronic literature in AI, they're all dialogic. And I think that's a really useful way to think about it, is that it's not really fiction, it's not really poetry, it's always a dialogue. The more representational or mimetic AI works are, to me, the less interesting they are. So I find the weirdness of these systems, particularly now in this sort of transitional moment between the beginnings of generative AI and its normativity that it's moving towards, right? What it'll eventually become. Think about the history of photography. The first 30 years had much more formal experimentation than you've seen in the last decade. And I don't think of it necessarily as a tool for narrative creation, but more as an environment for narrative play with human language as a probabilistic cognitive system. I was going to just tell you about a couple more things, but we're out of time. Anyway, we just did a major exhibition with the 5-venue exhibition on AI art across the city of Bergen in October, an exhibition that we did in Berkeley the previous year. I have a number of academic publications online about writing with AI. The first one was about sort of the problems embedded in these systems. The most recent one that just came out is the fully developed version of that last project I was showing, but along with a long essay on text image writing and the digital unconscious. It even talks a little bit about medieval, the connection to say medieval studies. Yeah. And the two projects, well, one project, XDN, is a research project that I'm leading, and the Center for Digital Narrative is a center where we're focusing on all kinds of different types of narrative and digital media. And the binding concept there is the idea of algorithmic narrativity, which is the combination of the human ability to understand experience through narrative with the power of the computer to manipulate symbols and process and generate data. There's an essay about that concept that was out recently in Dialogues in Digital Society. Also, there's a podcast. So there's Off Center, which is when we started up the research center, I talked to our communications people at the university, and they said, "You've got a good voice for radio." I think it was their way of saying that I have a good face for radio. But what we've done now is over the course of 3 seasons, we're just about to record our 35th interview with all sorts of different kinds of experts in digital narrative. So it's a really interesting archive on everything from, fan fiction to the connection between memes and the January 6th uprising, to AI filmmaking, a bunch of different things. And there's a spin-off now that's very short podcasts, about 10 to 15 minutes bi-weekly, with my partner on the XDN project, David Javed Johnson, who's an expert on AI, where we're just looking at things that are happening very rapidly in general in AI. Sorry, I'll get you the potato and strawberry. Yeah. So thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really very, very impressive presentation. And I think there are lots of questions. So this is interdisciplinary. We have people with background as historians, textual scholars, art historians, philosophers. So don't worry if this is not your field of expertise. I'm sure you're open for questions from all directions. And yeah, so please, those from
and online too.
Online, please raise your hand, or I think you can also just unmute yourself or make a note in the chat, and then we move forward from here. Okay. Also, put your camera so we see a bit who's participating. We have also nice names here, so very familiar names. Okay. Good, please go. Questions, comments.
Anyone, someone here. So somebody's got to come up with a question.
You look like you have some questions.
Or I can just show you some movies.
Ulrike presenting a week ago. When was it? No, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, 1 week ago.
Yeah. Now you can ask your own question.
Yeah, I
I would ask you, please, those here in the room, to come here in front to the, because here's the microphone. It's that one. It's fine from there, so don't worry. If you don't understand what's spoken here in the room, just let us know. But that should work. Ulrike.
Okay, so thank you so much for the interesting talk. And I was, of course, or one of the intriguing aspects from your title, in which you have the cyborg aspect. You didn't have the chance to go into this as much. And I remember very vaguely that the cyborg was always something machine and human growing together. So how do you envisage this with AI?
Yeah, well, I do think there's this, that there is this sort of co-evolution always between humans and our technologies, in that we're shaping the tools and the tools are shaping us. simultaneously. In terms of why I'm thinking, and cyborg authorship is also an old term. I know Espen Orseth used it a long time ago, for example. But I think it becomes a relevant term here in that this is maybe the first time where there is this layer of what I describe as cognition occurring. Once the human writer writes, there's this very complex system that then is cognizing and responding to that writing in a different way. So it's not that there's another intelligence in the room in the way that we think of human intelligence, but there is this extension of us that's doing something that's largely, there's a step where it goes sort of beyond our control. And so it's sort of both extending our capacities and doing strange things to them. It's like an arm, the third arm that maybe you say, go off and grab that apple, and it does, but except it brings back an orange.
Yeah. Please, can you come to the front? Okay.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
this presentation. I was interested in the authorship part
Yeah.
in a double way. First, like for example, when you produce like this image, this text, then who is the owner of this image, of this text, and who we should, I don't know, claim the attributes for this? And on the other way, all of this image and all of this text, we know they are created by like sort of take everything from the internet without giving anyone to the author, so the people that produces this kind of technology. So how we should pose to this to the fact that this large language model use all of this collective intelligence without giving to the
very, very complex and problematic aspect of LLMs and text generation engines. However, well, to the question of like who owns these images, I would say no one. I mean, really, and actually, that's the legitimate, correct answer. At least depending on each given system, but they're in the public domain. You know, the output's in the public domain, right? I can package it up in a book and copyright the book. But you could do anything you'd like with the images. Now, as to the sourcing of the images, this is something that there's going to be a lot of debate about and a lot of lawsuits about and a lot of hand-wringing about for years to come. And eventually, I think what will happen is major corporations are going to sue other major corporations, and then eventually they're going to pay other major corporations money for content that they took from authors and artists originally, and then published online. I think Getty Archive was one of the first people to sue corporations to sue Stable Diffusion. So they'll get some money out of it. Of course, Getty Archive had scraped a bunch of images from the internet, packaged them, and then had them online. And then their business model, a big part of it is just suing people who take these images that were in the public domain that have been packaged. So for me, I mean, I understand the concerns. My daughter she's a visual artist, she hates text to image generation engines. However, coming from the field I come from, almost everyone in my field, we've always just put our stuff online and said, we don't really care about copyright. We think copyright's got tons of historical problems. And it's more exciting for us to just, you take it, you go read it. That's fine. You know, you go experience it. So I'm not too worried. Also, it's not just sort of it's not a photocopier. It's doing something completely different with all of these images that it's using as a basis. It's very difficult to get something to, well, depending on the engine, but to get to, it's not just saying, okay, that's the image that this text prompt is like, I'm going to take it and I'm going to reprint it, right? It's averaging all these different things together and then creating an image. Now, should have they, from the beginning, asked for creators' permission to do this? Probably yes. But they didn't. And now what are we gonna do now? Turn it back? What we're gonna do now is see companies suing other companies, and then they'll settle. And in the end, the writers and the artists will just have what they had before. That's right. I mean, so.
And what about at least crediting? So I
Yeah.
took this actually from here, so I owe
Yeah,
you
yeah.
a thank you. Also.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I should when I say like, I made this thing together with all of the authors and artists whose work has ever been represented on the internet. Okay. Yeah, it's the whole world, right?
Sure.
And who owns language? Is an interesting question. Google has certainly tried to own it, but we don't own language, and we're always remixing. Every sentence that comes out of my mouth is a remix, right? So that's where I don't know. I'm more, and I also think we could just kind of turn away and say, oh, we won't use that because of the unethical basis for it. But to me, there's also a certain responsibility of artists to engage and see what you can do with these systems so that it's not all just dominated by the global corporations that are going to be the ones who figure out how to make billions of dollars off of it. Right? Yeah.
Federico.
How is changing the scenario with the new evolutions, the new features, in particular of ChatGPT, with memories, for example, with customization, with the possibility to create specific GPTs for specific tasks, and so on. So, how do you see this evolution?
Yeah, well, I mean, so much is changing so quickly that it's difficult to sort of summarize. I think the recent reason feature, which is where they always call these things they shouldn't like. It's basically just that the models are now breaking down problems into individual steps, processing those a bit more slowly, and then building upon what's sort of like a logical chain, which they weren't doing before, right? I think that's coming up with much more interesting responses to things. I think the thing that I think is most exciting right now is massively multimodal systems, right? So, because right now you can do so many things in so many different platforms. So what we've been doing a lot of experimenting with in the center is sort of like, oh, okay, will we very soon have an era of the desktop filmmaker, right? And we will, because you can take, so for example, Jave, my collaborator on the project, he spent the last month creating a film a day, a 30-second film each day. And the way that he did this was I think sometimes he wrote the script, but he often generated the script. And then in Runway, there's a feature now called, trying to remember the name of the feature, Take One or Take Two or something. But anyway, where you record yourself and you record your facial features as you read a text, right? And then you can take just an image of a person and upload that, and it creates an image of that person saying it, right? And then you can take your voice and you can use a voice-to-voice engine and modify your voice. So you can immediately create these kind of virtual actors. I used a kind of early, sort of different AI actor thing in the newscast part of Monde. But if you just think about that, and the apparatus that's typically involved in making a film, and it's that's just fundamentally amazing. So I think there's when we did the art show, for example, there was like text to 3D printing projects, which again, this is crazy, that you can just type a prompt and then the system generates a model, which you can just go to your 3D printer and create a material artifact from that text. And they're moving towards, probably in the next year, there'll be what they call like world models, where the systems can produce entire environments. So for example, a game environment. So it's, that for me is just like, what a crazy opportunity for writers, for artists. At the same time as, again, the other big downside, of course, is all sorts of people are going to lose jobs, right? But what a crazy, for me, it's as exciting as, the 1990s when the web first came about. I think it's kind of going to be as big a paradigm shift as that.
I have a question. I don't know if it's really a question, so I come very much from a different angle of perspective and making use of ChatGPT and large language models. There's also Martina Scholger in the audience online. So we just finished an article report about where we ask people to experiment with large language models in order to perform accurate tasks, processing data, so to make use of it, so from a more scientific point of view. And so our aim is always to control what the results are, to improve the quality, accuracy, replicability, to be transparent, to control also the context. So quite the opposite of what you have been doing. So we then were talking about prompt engineering. How can we make prompts that precise in order to provide the best results? So quality, or however you evaluate, but the quality you want is creativity. And so maybe we abuse the tool, and it's against the nature of the tool, and the real potential is in the creative aspect. So maybe you can say something about this. And
no, I don't know. I think this is more. I think creative is more abuse of the tool.
Yeah. Because then I wonder if creativity is the better use of it, and what's closer to the nature of the technology. Is there really something? So I mean, the thing about the Arctic excursion was in that direction, but I always wonder: is this really what is really surprising? Because also the visual things, so they are really cool. But I sense like I understand your daughter if she hates it, because is this what today an artist would produce? If that can be produced by ChatGPT, then actually it's not really creative. It's maybe I can use it as a tool, but I want to go exactly into something that is really surprising me, because the results of ChatGPT do not surprise me. I'm not sure that's the case.
Well, and they're getting less surprising.
Yeah. You said it. So it's all more normative, more rules, more control. So we lose all this creativity, or the surprise, or we get more used to what we get. So the aesthetics, I think, is always very almost homogeneous. So except you really give a prompt that says, so do something against all the artistic rules or norms that you encounter in everything you see. So do something that goes beyond. I don't know if that's actually able to do so. So I don't know if you.
Or you recombine it. I mean, the actual finished projects, I would have shown some videos of because actually the video part was the most interesting. Yeah, I think both and, right? I could show something that I just did or just experimented with. Let's see if we get to ChatGPT here. Oh wait, is this going to be like?
I'm not sharing yet.
Okay.
You're not sharing yet.
Okay. It still has this. Okay. I don't know if I have it accessible here. Anyway, what I had asked it, so I wanted to update C, because they actually, one of the things they explicitly claim in the latest release of ChatGPT is that it's getting better at narrating, right?
Yeah.
So something I asked it to generate a little story. It wasn't that much better, really. But what was interesting to me was then I said, why don't you give me a breakdown of the major characters in the story and the major plot events, and then deliver it as a spreadsheet, right? So I was able to do this very quickly.
You can't see that.
Oh, you can't see it.
If you
Am I not sharing?
no, yeah.
Okay.
You have to confirm share.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, no,
Yeah. So, I mean, this isn't like anything mind blowing, except that if we think about this from a traditional sort of digital humanities perspective. So this was, I asked it just to give a timeline in this particular spreadsheet, but I did this with several other things. Several other, I asked it for a description of the characters and other kind of criteria, right? And it's able to just spit out this data. So you can feed it a spreadsheet, and with pretty high accuracy, it's just able to spit out that data. And then I asked it to, I'm losing track of windows here. But anyway, I asked it to provide an interpretation of, where is my window here? Go back here. Anyway, so I asked it to provide an interpretation. This is again
only sharing the spreadsheet.
Okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I asked it to give me an interpretation of the piece of the story that it generated as a digital poem in HTML and JavaScript, right? And I did this with several iterations of it a few times, but it was able to. This isn't like great, and it's not. It's nothing that I would like publish or distribute as a digital poem myself, but it was able to just do that when I just said I give it very few parameters in a prompt, and it was able to spit out not only the digital humanities style breakdown of different data from the text, but also to make and interpret and explain an interpretation. It explained why this little dot's circling around and so forth. And give me the code immediately, and then I'm able to run that in a browser immediately. So that, not that it did it very well, but the fact that it can do that so quickly, and that with a little bit of interaction from me, It could, so one of the things I didn't show, for example, was even back in, this was 2022, start of 2023, the dark ages in AI time. But I spent a month and a half and I wrote 40 digital poems, right? So just like every day, I spent between 10 minutes to a couple hours having these conversations with the engine and it producing code. And then at that time, I had to go in and hand edit a lot. But I tried that again recently, and I was able to just have an idea for a poem and maybe 2 or 3 prompts, and I had something working that was close to what I'd imagined. So I think these things, if you think about the labor that was involved in any kind of digital humanities, if you think of even something like just counting the number of particular pronouns, for example, this type of digital humanities project that used to be conducted often. Yeah, that would take people months. And now you just feed the text in and you hit a button and there you have that counted. You ask for a visualization of it. That's going to come out in about 30 seconds, right? And that's just going to get better and better. So it's for the sort of things that you're talking about. It's going to be an immense labor saver. Of course, there's a lot of people in all these different fields who are, including like digital poetry. Nick Montfort's very, in some ways, resentful of these things because he spent years laboring on these complex systems that all of a sudden it's, 2 seconds.
I think we have room for 1, 2 short questions, short answers. We are running over time. I think we can talk.
Yeah,
nice for everyone who wants to join us, maybe for an aperitif or for lunch. There is Paolo. See, yeah, please.
Hi, thank you, Scott, for this very inspiring presentation. So my question is, can safety AI standards, safety AI limits can be used productively? So in a creative sense. So there is a way to play around with these limits of the discourse and make it interesting for creativity. I mean, sex, drugs, and violence historically always has been used by writers to advance an artistic vision, to push the limits, push the boundaries. I think of surrealism, for example. But maybe today is very challenging to equate, and not so straightforward, to equate morality and creativity, and maybe ChatGPT or large language models pose question in this way. So what's your, I'm very curious about your perspective, your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's complex because there are certain things that you probably don't want the models to do. You probably don't want them to spit out very detailed descriptions of, although you can get them from books already, but how to, how to use uranium to turn it into a bomb or create a weapons, nuclear weapons factory, things like that, right? And there's things like child pornography, of course, that are very concerning. And if you create video child pornography, for example, that's concerning and it should be illegal. My perspective, though, is that that's what you have laws for. So if someone is distributing child pornography now, and then they use an engine to make child pornography and distribute that, it's just as illegal, right? I'm not sure that it should be this hyper vigilant alignments of the systems that should be restricting things that we could talk about, particularly not in such a dumb way. The example of the lesbians in Fond du Monde is a great example of that, where it's just, that's on a bad word list because lesbian's more used in pornography, the term, than gay. So ergo, the world gets no more representations of lesbian women. Super dumb way to enforce an ideology. And then who's deciding? That's the thing, is like, and there's also these markers of both the legal hypervigilance, but also a kind of particular sort of new agey California ideology that's very present. So it's not just that there's ideology represented, it's like of one space, right? This sort of hyper utopian technocratic technology is going to solve all of our problems, and we're going to live in a delightful, peaceful world. And maybe we shouldn't be having so much sex and violence and drugs and in literature and in television and in media. But I think it's not okay for one group to decide that, and then to make it so that we can't even deal with the problems that we face as a society. We can't discuss them. It's not a way to make things go away.
See a nice analogy here. So yeah, no, but so we had Jerome de Cloak, who's a media art researcher in Amsterdam, and he made a presentation here about art, contemporary art, and censorship in China. And so he was very able to show that there is critical art right now happening in China, and what's important to understand, and also the power and to estimate the value of this art is, of course, knowing the context. Yeah. So someone singing a song in that context or that context makes a completely different artwork, or makes it an artwork at the first place. And so the more we know or are surrounded by AI, knowing the context, maybe that's a way then to engage with the rules, the norms that are from California or from wherever, or from legal institutions. So the awareness and the knowledge about the context, what is happening here, in which context is, I mean, that's always where art is taking place. So art without context, it doesn't, I don't know, I'm not an art historian, maybe Stefan, correct me if I'm wrong. So
yeah, and I think when things are used for nefarious purposes, there's also already laws that say, oh, you can't do that. I mean, in whatever systems apply in whatever countries apply, some of them oppressive, but there's already laws saying, like, this is permitted, this is not permitted. Why do you need to do that as a software developer? You don't.
Well, so it's late. If there is one last urgent.
I have one just
okay,
comment.
Stefana, last word to you.
The last one, but I will be really short, even though the question maybe is too large and opens too many implications. But yesterday we have a brief discussion with our student in class. I don't know if Oscar is there, but we start arguing that AI image are little bit boring because are now too much recognizable. And that thank you to AI, now our way of seeing, of approaching art historical images, but in general, or digital images, is changed because we are much more focused on detail. Do you think it's true?
Much more focused on
detail, to notice differences, aspect that in other with other image are not so we were not moved to notice, because now we are challenged to detect if the image we are looking at is true or false, if it's a fake.
Yeah. No, I mean, one thing I just say to that is that I think there's going to be, in a way, people might not buy this, but I think there's going to be renewed value in human-made art, right? And part of that's too, just because, like, oh, that artist, you could see their hand slips there, right? Or they have this weird thing that they do, right? That's completely different from what comes out of an AI system. But I think what's interesting to me is, in a way, more than what comes out of the engine is the idea that it is writing. And for me, the interesting thing is sort of, how do you write with banality? How do you write with that? I mean, that image that I have at the start with the typewriter and the tongues, and all the objects spilling out of it, is something that I really think about. Like, how do you write with a million voices averaged together, that can cross all these different things together, and then spit out images? It's not so much necessarily that any individual image is interesting, but it's interesting as language. Well, thanks for the question. I'm gonna think that one over.
We'll have maybe tomorrow. I'm sorry not to be here today, but definitely.
I'm really sad that I've been here for a couple of days and I saw a lot of beautiful Venice, but unfortunately I'm flying to Germany tomorrow. I'm going to do a talk at Humboldt University in Berlin.
So we have to get you back. There's too much open questions, I think, and I mean,
yeah.
In the past,
and looking forward to getting some association between the center here and our center as well. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Or we bring you, Stefano, to Bergen and Paolo anyway.
Yeah. There's definitely opportunities for guests.
We have to, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolute highlight and a wonderful finish for our seminar series. We will announce the spring-summer series not shortly, but early next year. So we have already a nice lineup of potential candidates for another nice and interesting series next year. So watch our usual channels, and I hope you will get notice and find what you are interested in.